I was having an affair and I got tired of this woman. Um, and I started talking to somebody else on social media. And those two ladies found out about each other. And they both contacted me and said, "We know what you're doing." And they said, "We're going to contact your wife if you don't tell her in the next hour." I was actually out on a walk when I got that call, and there's traffic going by. And the first thought I had was, are these cars going fast enough to actually kill me, or am I just going to get injured when I walk in front of one? Because that's what I wanted to do.
Hello, my dear listener, and welcome back to the Happy on the Inside podcast. Today's guest is about to blow your mind. Kevin Tuttle, a man I met 2 years ago who's since become a dear friend of ours. Kevin is a founder of Spirit Public Relations Company, where he helps fearless entrepreneurs and thought leaders to speak their truth. But here's the kicker. Kevin's not here to talk business. He's ripping off the band-aid on childhood trauma that he went through that led him to self-sabotaging his relationship with his beautiful wife, his children, and God. We are going to dive deep into the stuff that most people run from. If you are a man and you feel stuck, scared, or just plain lost, this episode is your lifeline. So grab a tissue, maybe a notebook, and let's get ready to change some lives.
Kevin Tuttle, thank you so much for coming. And your story is just incredible. And I'm looking forward to dive in. But before we do this, what is the definition of trauma means to you?
Trauma is the pain endured, usually as a child, but can be later in life. Just any unresolved pain that you haven't worked through emotionally, especially. And that trauma can just affect your life in every single facet until it's addressed.
Why do you think it's so important to speak up and heal?
Well, man, where do you start? I don't feel that you can truly live and be who you're supposed to be unless you've addressed that trauma in your life. Burying it, pretending it didn't exist, pretending it didn't affect your life, that just eats you up. And you have to face yourself. I spent many years running from who I was due to the trauma I had as a child, and it never did any good for me. And it wasn't until I addressed those fears, addressed myself about 2 years ago, that I finally was able to start living and to be who I'm supposed to be.
This is so spot on. Start living, because so many people don't realize that it's holding us back.
You can't function in life. I mean, the patterns that you've created through your trauma, those negatively affect your lives. I've not heard of anybody who had these patterns that did amazing things for them later in life. It doesn't work that way. So it's definitely something that you have to, face head on and realize that it's okay that you don't have it all figured out. Life is a journey, and even the bad stuff can eventually become something that we can view as something beautiful, because it made us who we are.
I love it. Kevin, where is your trauma is coming from?
So when I was about 5 years old, we had just moved to Alaska. My dad was in the Air Force and got stationed in Fairbanks, Alaska, or in North Pole, technically. Shortly after that, he separated from the Air Force and we moved out to the bush of Alaska. So we lived 60 miles north of Fairbanks, and we lived in a small log cabin, no running water, no electricity. There was a little community out there. I went to a little public school that had about 20 kids, K through 12. But shortly before we moved out to the bush, in the community that's in North Pole, in our neighborhood, there was a fort that the neighborhood kids had built out in the woods. And it was this fort that, at 5 years old, I wasn't allowed to go there because it's for the bigger kids. It's for the 12 and 13 and 14-year-olds. And I didn't know what was going on back there, but I heard all sorts of great things about this fort. It's this mysterious fort. it turned out that my sister took me to this fort one day when she knew no other kids were there.
How
And she
old
said,
was she?
she's 7 years older than me.
Mhm.
And she said, "Do you want to see what's in the fort?" I'm like, "Yes, finally the fort, the mystical fort." So she took me out there. There were cigarette butts and beer cans and that sort of thing. And this crummy little, just had like plywood walls. It was nothing, as far as the majesty of this fort. But so it had just garbage and stuff in there. And then it had a stack of magazines. And she asked me if I wanted to see what was in the magazines, and they were pornography. And I had no idea what I was looking at, but she wanted to show them to me. It just made me feel awful. I didn't understand. So fast forward then to moving out to the bush. It's then that my sister began molesting me, was when we moved out there. And that continued for about 2 years. So I was about 6 to 7, almost 8 years old before it stopped. But it was that, the sexual molestation by my sister.
Kevin, did you tell anyone about what was happening?
No, not a soul. I had parents who were very loving to me, but for some reason I was so fearful of telling, and I wasn't even threatened, other than my sister saying, "Don't tell, this won't be good." I felt like I needed to be loyal to her and not get her in trouble, because that was kind of what she said, "This will get me in trouble, so don't say anything." And she was the one that I played with all the time. She would play outside with me. And um, I had an older brother who was 2 years older than my sister, and he didn't know anything. Nobody knew. I didn't tell anybody. In fact, I didn't tell my parents for 30 years. And the secrets, everything, it just builds in your body. It was awful, but no, I didn't tell anybody.
It's very common when, even without any threat, kids are so afraid to speak up. Kevin, how this unresolved trauma impacted your personal life, your relationship with your wife and your kids?
In every way possible, it impacted. Um, I told my wife before we got married. She was the only one I had told. I felt like she needed to know this. She was horrified, of course, shocked. And then it's like, "Well, you told me. Okay, great. So, we can move forward now." And there was never any talk of, should you get counseling for that? Should it was more like, okay, we know now. And that was just our immaturity at the time too. But the biggest place where it impacted me was the repeated patterns of destruction in my life, because I would sabotage anything good. I would start to sabotage. If it's a friendship, if it's a job, whatever it was, my brain was rewired through that trauma, and it made me think and do things that a rational person wouldn't do. Uh, Today, I wouldn't try to find somebody to try to take my pain away. And that's one thing that I constantly tried to do. There was a lot of infidelity in my life, because I felt, my wife is not taking this pain away. She's not healing me. And so this relationship can't be right. It's her fault. So there has to be somebody else out there who could take it away from me. And then I would move on to the next person and the next person. And I was very, very good at keeping these secrets, because that's something that I learned at that through that trauma, is the secrets. So my wife never knew. And, ultimately it was just a destructive pattern over and over and over again. And the amount of sorrow I have for my actions, and the amount of guilt and all of that, it's been so great to finally address myself and to stop running, because that's what I felt I was doing. I'm 45 years old, and it wasn't until 2 years ago that I addressed any of this. And that's a long time to run. It's a long time. So yeah, as far as how it affected my kids, I've always been proud of how good father that I am. Okay, I've protected my kids from the moment they were born. I've tried to, not just medically, but in any facet, emotionally, always, the one thing I'm most proud of actually in my life is that I didn't pass down what was done to me to my kids, because that's a typical pattern of somebody who's been abused as a child, that you end up abusing your own children. And that's the number one thing I'm so grateful to God for, giving me that much grace, that this was never even a thought in my life to put that evil onto my kids. I knew it would die with me. And but it affected my kids overall, in that I was still running from myself. I scheduled a lot of work conferences away from home. I got into cycling, really into cycling, where, I'd go and do 120, 130 miles. And, that takes 8, 9 hours of the day sometimes, or weekend long bicycle trips or whatever it was, that I could just be away from the family, because when I wasn't there, then there was no guilt, right? Then I felt like, and also the exercise took over, where it felt like this therapy that I needed to punish myself, and just sweat all day and be miserable sometimes. But whatever it was, it felt therapeutic in a sense. And then I felt like I could see my family again. So it's been a very twisted relationship sometimes. So
Thank you so much for sharing, Kevin. I wonder, what was your aha moment when you stopped and thought, now this is the time to heal? And what did you do first?
well, I'd like to take all the credit for it. Like, I looked at myself and said, it's time, but that's not how it happened. I was having an affair, and I got tired of this woman. Um, and I started talking to somebody else on social media, and those two ladies found out about each other, and they both contacted me and said, we know what you're doing, and they said, we're going to contact your wife if you don't tell her in the next hour. I was actually out on a walk when I got that call, and there's traffic going by, and the first thought I had was, are these cars going fast enough to actually kill me, or am I just going to get injured when I walk in front of one? Because that's what I wanted to do. And, it's a residential neighborhood, so they were only going 25, and I'm not that good at math, and I couldn't figure it out in my head if it would kill me or not. So I was like, you know what? I love my family and my kids too much anyway. It wasn't a serious suicidal thought. But I, I said, okay, it's time. So I went back home and I talked to my wife and told her what I was doing. Yeah, that was the aha moment. But it wasn't just about the earthly moment of that, the my physical moment. It was more spiritual based. I grew up as, in a Christian household. I had a relationship with God from the time I was 10 years old until probably my college years. Early college years is when I started moving away from God. And it felt like it was that moment that God like grabbed me by the collar and gave me a good slap and said, Kevin, it's time now, come back. Because I feel like I have a lot to offer. I feel like, I've always been a good person outside of this realm, right? Like, I've always helped people. I've generously given of myself and financially, and all those things. I never want to see harm come to people. Yet my own destruction was something that I was always okay with, because I always felt like I wanted to die. Like inside, I always like, I want to die. And I was in the Air Force, and I volunteered to go to Afghanistan, because I thought, look, if I can go there and I can get into a battle and I can die there, then I will die as, an American hero, or whatever, however you want to look at that, right? It was just so sad. My life was sad without God in it. And, it was that point when God grabbed me and said, it's time now that that I really felt it is time, and I really repented. I repented to God. I repented to my wife, and I actually had to repent to myself. And that, believe it or not, that was probably harder than repenting to my wife, because accepting yourself after everything you know that you've done and all the trauma you've been through, to say that you can love yourself, that's been the hardest thing.
Kevin, I really appreciate you being so vulnerable and so open and so honest, because not many realize that all those destructive behavior is coming from our childhood. It's not because we are bad people. It's just we didn't have this strength and this courage to address those traumas and to see how trauma is causing all these challenges and negative things in our life. You know, in my previous relationship, I was constantly the one who would leave the relationship or cheat on my boyfriends. And it wasn't because I'm a dishonest person or bad person. I think I was so afraid to get closer or to let them come closer to me. The reason I'm telling you this, thank you for opening up. I feel like I'm not alone.
Well, you're welcome. You are not alone. We are not alone. When you look at the stats, I think the stats say something like 1 in 5 people have been sexually abused in one fashion or another. So imagine that. Imagine when you go to church and you sit around and there's 100 people in that room. Imagine how many people there have been affected by trauma. Or you go to a concert where there's 3,000 people, and we're not alone. We're not alone at all. It's just we're the ones who are moving past that stage of, this is what happened to me and I have to live with it eternally. No, you don't. You can get rid of this. The trauma can be overcome, and then you can become somebody new, somebody better, and somebody who's living freely. I'm a huge part of the reason I wanted to join the Air Force in the first place was because I believe in freedom so much. Yet I'm living this life that is keeping me in chains, both spiritually and physically. And I kept repeating these gross patterns that weren't free at all. So now, I continue to fight for freedom all the time, if it's medical freedom or, freedom from tyranny, but also the freedom from trauma. And it's amazing. To be free is the greatest thing. That's why in the Bible, it even says you're supposed to be free. So it's a beautiful thing.
You've mentioned that you haven't told your parents what was happening to you for 30 years. What was their reaction?
So I was actually on the phone with my parents. They live in Israel, and I was living in Florida at the time. And I had not seen my sister in, I don't know, a few years at that point. And conversation I'm having with my parents, they're telling me all about her, and her name is Nicole. So they're telling me all about Nicole, what she's doing, and with how her kid is doing and stuff. I said, Mama, I don't care. I don't care about Nicole. Just stop talking to me about her. And because every time I even heard the name Nicole, like this knot in my stomach would appear, right? And I get really agitated and triggered. And so my mom was like, what is your problem? What do you have against her? Like, all the time, every time I start talking about her, you get mad. Like, what is the issue? And I basically just snapped. I'm like, do you really want to know? Are you ready? Do you really want to hear? And I told them, I said, remember those times on the Elliott Highway in north of Fairbanks, Alaska, in the bush, when you guys were searching for God? You didn't know what was happening to me upstairs in that cabin. You didn't realize that Nicole was molesting me. You didn't know that every time you went into town to go grocery shopping, that she molested me. You didn't know any of these things because I kept them secret. And the reason I didn't tell for so long was because I knew that if I told, that it would ruin the relationship that my parents and my brother had with my sister. And, I believe that that eventually actually came to pass. They don't have much of a relationship, but you know what? It's just the truth. The truth is the only thing that you should tell. The reaction that my parents had to me was one of complete love. My mom broke down crying. My dad, it's hard to, I didn't want them to feel those things. I didn't want them to feel the responsibility because I don't ultimately believe it was their fault. This, but they did not cut me out. They did not accuse me of being a liar. They embraced me and said that they're so sorry.
What an amazing, amazing response. And I felt exactly the same. We are trying to protect our parents. I was one of the reasons I couldn't tell my mom because I thought she's not going to handle it.
Yeah,
But opening up to her, I've realized it helped her to get on your healing journey. It's like Pandora box was open for her, and all these signs of me, begging her for not leaving me with him, or why I was so angry at him. It just everything made a sense for her, and it helped her to open up to me what she was going through as a child.
very true. Very true. As twisted as it sounds, you're giving that person an opportunity to love you. It's hard. None of this is easy. Facing yourself and the trauma, and it's all very, very hard. It's physically draining. It's emotionally draining. Like after therapy, sometimes my wife she's like, "How did it go?" And I can't even answer. I just want to go lay down because I'm spent. But it's I don't know. I feel like it's one of those bike workouts where I'm going for 120 miles and afterwards you're exhausted. Only I feel like that after an hour just talking about stuff that happened to me. So the amount of work on your body is similar in a weird way. But
Exactly.
one of the things that you mentioned with not telling your mom, I've read this book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk.
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic book for anybody out there who is just starting to face your trauma. Get this book. I guarantee it's going to help you. And one of the things it talks about in it is loyalty. We have this innate sense of loyalty to those who are near to us, and we want to protect them. And he says in it, the price of this loyalty is unbearable feelings of loneliness, despair, and the inevitable rage of helplessness. Rage that has nowhere to go is redirected against the self in the form of depression, self-hatred, and self-destructive actions. That couldn't nail me any more than it did. I mean, that the self-destructiveness, the self-hatred, all of that has gone away by facing myself and getting help for this trauma. So amazing book. Again, please go get that.
I would also highly recommend it. Knowledge is power. Honestly, when I started to tap into my trauma, I realized that I did so many things without even knowing where is it coming from. And Kevin, talking about parents, our parents biologically designed to kill for their kids. And by keeping a secret, we do a dishonor for them because they really, as you mentioned, don't have an opportunity to protect us. But I understand not many parents have this feeling for their kids. And so I still think if you don't have this relationship with your parents, this is for my listeners, look for someone who went through a similar situation. Look for someone who knows how it feels and who is already there on another side of the tunnel, because asking for help is what helped me.
Yeah, you have to find what it is that is causing the destruction, and that comes through the therapy. Recently in our bathroom, we had a little bit of mold, and turned out that little bit of mold was not a little bit. We had to tear apart the entire bathroom to get rid of this mold. And I thought, this is what occurs to you with secrets. Secrets are mold. They fester, they germinate because one secret on top of another, and now you're growing the mold that is so toxic and destructive and deadly. It just starts spreading. And then pretty soon, in order to get rid of it, you got to tear it all down. You got to, remove everything. And it's a pain. It hurts. It's burdensome. But then after everything gets put back together, it's perfect. It's operating as it should. It's clean. It's holy. It's pure. And yeah, it's so worth it. You can't live with the mold. It's just going to kill you.
I bloody love this analogy. Honestly, it literally explained the trauma. I love it, Kevin.
Thank you. I'll send you a bill. You can use it.
Copyright.
Right.
For this podcast. Kevin, what would you say if you would have an opportunity to your 5 years old self?
Yeah. I mentioned the fort earlier, and this is something that my therapist and I have covered. The fort is where everything started for me. It's the first time I saw pornography. And he took me back to that fort and he said, tell me about the day. I had to tell him about the weather, everything that I could remember. It was a gray spring day. It was chilly out. It was mid-morning, giving him every detail I possibly could. So, okay, tell me what you see in the fort. And I told him about the cigarette butts and the beer cans. And he said, what else is there? And I said, well, the magazines are there. And then he had Nicole show me the magazine. And he said, now what? What do you want to do? Because as that 5-year-old, I wanted to run, but I didn't. And he says, you can change it. What do you want to do? I said, I want to run. He said, okay, run. So I did. And he said, where are you running to? So I thought about that. I'm like, I'm running home. Home is where I felt safe. But he said, well, who's going to be home? And neither of my parents were home. So nobody would be there when I showed up, right? So I'm running home, but to what? And he said, what about you, Kevin? And I didn't understand. Like, what do you mean? He said, how about Kevin today is waiting for 5-year-old Kevin? And he said, I said, I would love that. I would love to run to myself because I know who I am and how I would comfort that kid. He says, okay, then run to yourself. And then he asked me what I would do. And I said, I would get on my knees and embrace the 5-year-old who's scared to death, who's running for his life. I would embrace him and tell him it is not his fault. Because that's the biggest thing that I've carried with my life, is that all of this was my fault. At 6 years old, it was my fault that I didn't stop it. At 7 years old, it was my fault that I didn't stop it. But I was a child. And, I take my mentality as an adult thinking, okay, I could have stopped it, but I was a little kid and it wasn't my fault. And that's what I would tell myself, that what your sister showed you is not your fault. You are not in trouble. You are safe. And we can move on from this. So that was the most memorable session that I've had with him, to be able to kind of change that memory, where it not only changed my outlook of things, but it got to the point where recently I was having a conversation with somebody and they mentioned the name Nicole that had nothing to deal with my sister, just somebody else with the name Nicole. And it didn't trigger me. And when I got in the car and I was driving home after that meeting, I reflected on that. I'm like, that name didn't trigger me. And then I thought, I'm there. I said, I forgive her. I actually forgive her. I don't want anything to do with her. Don't get me wrong. I don't want a relationship with her. She just, whatever happens to her. But she doesn't own me anymore. By forgiving her, I've put all the guilt on her shoulders. Everything's with her. It wasn't my fault. And that again is so liberating.
Kevin, I was getting so emotional while you were telling this story. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Kevin, what would be your best advice for other men who is going through a similar situation?
First of all, you have to turn your life over to God. Without God, there's no foundation. All right, you can think that the world it just appeared here, but without God, without a creator, there's no foundation for anything. And so you need to get your faith right. And then you just need to address yourself, find a therapist who deals with trauma. There's a lot of good ones out there, and they can do these types of tactics to take you back, to change some memories, to work through everything that's hurting you. Again, that mold is just going to spread. And what you're doing in your personal life, if you're watching pornography, you got to stop. If you're watching, anything that you're seeing that isn't righteous and that isn't right, you got to knock it off. And it's not just men. This is women too, right? I mean, we're all humans. We all do things we shouldn't be doing. But the trauma, the growth of the mold inside of you, only the cleansing bleach of Jesus and spirituality can actually remove this from your life.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you.
Before we go, do you have any concluding thoughts?
I mentioned cycling earlier. There's a bicycle ride that takes place every year across the state of Iowa. It's called RAGBRAI. And I did that ride numerous times. But the first time I did it, my daughter was about a year and a half old. And I had never left her before. And the ride is a week long across the state. So I was gone for 8 days, and when I came back, Ellie saw me from across the yard and she came running to me, and, I pick her up and I give her a big hug, and she gives me a big hug, and then she pushes her body away from my body, and we're face to face, and she grabbed my face and she just started bawling, just weeping. And then she put her head on my shoulders. That feeling of joy and missing somebody, and all of that can be felt by you just by addressing your trauma. You can eventually look at yourself in the mirror and grab your face out of love, and then just know that it's over. You're back. You're whole. You can feel complete. And I just encourage everybody out there to address this, please. You're going to be a better person for it. You're going to be able to live your life as was intended, to whatever your mission is here on life. We all have different missions. Whatever that is, you'll be able to do it. But until you address that trauma, it's not going to happen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Tuttle.